This is the Change Physician, episode 138.
Hey, folks, welcome back to the Change Physician podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, with my Amazeballs co-host, Miss Amazeballs herself, Dr. Melissa Katie. Dr. Katie, how are you today?
I am awesome.
You're awesome. Is everything Amazeballs? Amazeballs? That's right. We should actually make some Amazeballs and we can hand them out to the audience.
Amazeballs.
You actually have a physical Amazeball.
So is it going to have a little maze inside the ball?
I think it's just, well, it has to have a maze. It can't be a maze.
I know, but it kind of plays on the word.
Yeah. We'll figure it out. If you guys want your Amazeballs, you email us and let us know. And when we figure it out, maybe we'll send you one. But anyway, so today, if you don't mind, Melissa, I wanted to talk a little bit about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, and specifically relate to that intrinsic part, because I think this is really relevant to practice and certainly practice in the United States. And actually, if you are not a physician, but simply a physician ally, really just comes down to kind of your vocational drivers, like what it is that you're doing in your life. So would that be okay with you?
That'd be fine. I think that's a great topic.
Okay, so we know the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic are those things that are forced upon you, or you are doing them because there is some sort of external motivator to you, while intrinsic motivation is those things that are inherent in you, the drivers that you do because you want to do them, or you feel driven to do them rather than being told. And there is quite a bit of research about this topic, detailing that when you choose to do things for yourself for reasons that are self-supportive of you and personal inherent drivers, you tend to work better, you tend to put more effort in, and you tend to have better results overall, which is kind of always funny to me because we have all these external factors. If you kind of think about, like, even the educational system is designed around these external motivators of grades in some ways, where you have this external thing, you have the teachers promoting a specific of defined behaviors for you. When it comes to parenting, this is a tricky situation, is the balance between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. But the big takeaway for me about all this is when I started learning about the differences in motivators was really how can you develop, or how can you work around these kind of principles that help you to not do things because you have to do them, but because you want to do them, and wanting to do them in such a way that you feel fulfilled, that you feel that there's a reason behind it, there's a meaning for what you're doing, and it's sort of this ideal state that when we kind of think about a perfect practice. So any thoughts about that so far, or your experiences with extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation?
Yeah, I find it fascinating to begin with, but a couple of thoughts that came to mind is that, interestingly, you talk about children, and some of the things that are intrinsic within me were intrinsically driven when I was young, and they've become indoctrinated within my, I guess, identity in some ways. And so it's become, I would say, truly an intrinsic motivation for, whether it's how I, want to tidy up certain things. I probably got told I need to do this or that. And now whether it's the voice in my head that somehow subconsciously reminds me, I feel like it's my own personal, intrinsic drive to be that way, but it probably was fueled by some extrinsic motivation in the past. So that was kind of my first thought. And I think that we can do that as adults too. Like, something we know we should do, maybe we need someone to hold us accountable, and we need the extrinsic motivation of some sort. And maybe initially some kind of reinforcement that's positive. And then when you start reaping the benefits, perhaps maybe just being, exercising or eating better, and realize the benefits down the road, that then you become intrinsically motivated.
I think there definitely can be a transition there between the two. I think there's a little bit of overlap here when we're talking about intrinsic motivation and things like dissonance theory, like cognitive dissonance. This is why I love this stuff, because then we start getting into beliefs and behaviors and the reinforcement effects of all of them. But specifically, when it comes to intrinsic motivation, I kind of look at it as it's a positive motivation. Sometimes we do things because there's a guilt associated with it, like, oh my God, I need to clean the whatever, because
Right.
it's such a mess kind of a thing. I wouldn't, and I don't think that may be some way, maybe a mix of two, but there's a lot of extrinsic, like either a sense of shame or something with it.
Yeah.
But for intrinsic motivators, there's a common sort of trifecta. I love the things that come in threes that have been produced really since Dan Pink's book. Dan Pink, he's the journalist, and he's written a couple different books on salesman. There's one on sales, how to sell anything, I think it was. And this one was called Drive, which actually came first. And in Drive, he has sort of condensed some of his readings of what the research found into 3 core principles. And these 3 core principles then to being in intrinsic motivation have to do with autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And with each of those, that autonomy is this sense that you have a sense of control of what you are doing. So no one is, again, that extrinsic side, no one is telling you to do it. Nobody's forcing you to do it, but you are in control. So there's a high degree of perceived control element there. That does fit with the psychological literature when it talks about reactance. Like we tend to react against when someone tells us to do something. So if nobody's telling you to do it, in your sense of personal control is they're more likely to do it. Then mastery is doing something because there is a sense of improvement that as you do it, you tend to get better. And as you get better, you feel more confident in that action. So you're developing a skill of mastery, and that feels good. Like everybody likes to, you start off, you feel like a total idiot. If babies had better memory, it'd be kind of interesting to hear their stories about walking,
Yes.
I love that analogy when you kind of compare what a baby goes through to what an adult goes through, and how we will just throw up our hands and quit when things become difficult. If a baby did that, they would never walk.
Exactly.
They look pretty stupid when they're trying to do it. Sure, it's cute, but they look kind of funny. And then the last one is purpose. And I think purpose in many ways, maybe there's a lot of discussion on it, but what is it? What is purpose? And it's that sense of fulfillment, that there's meaning to what you do. And there's not only meaning to that you personally derive from it, but a lot of times, and this may be a little bit somewhat intrinsic, but there's meaning from others. Others are seeing meaning in what you do. So these 3 kind of key drivers there: the autonomy, the mastery, and purpose. And what I kind of found interesting, because this was triggered by I was reading something else today. I was like, oh, I remember those. And I dug up some other stuff that I had in my note cards, which I show all the time, or not all the time, but I mention all the time, was how often in the workplace, and in particularly in the modern healthcare system, we lose autonomy, we lose mastery in some ways, but we certainly lose a sense of purpose. In fact, I would say autonomy and purpose are the 2 that probably get lost in the equation quite a bit. So you've had sort of a different career path here, and you've been a little bit more active along the way. But what are your observations when it comes to autonomy, mastery, and purpose in healthcare? What have you seen?
Oh, I'll just first say that I love being my own boss. I don't feel 100% autonomous because 10% of my income comes from insurance, which I feel like I have to play that game. But there is a certain way that I like to care for patients, and I think that it was hard to align my values along with another business's purposes. And so I felt like I was always being kind of regulated in how I did things. It just felt like kind of like a square peg in a round hole feeling. And it just, as much as I kept trying to force that, it just never really fit. And so, 9 years later, being in a group practice, I decided to go out on my own. And there's so much joy in creating a process for patients that there's, I don't need to do it full time. Part time gives me the satisfaction of it. But to know, to create a process that I create the reinforcement and actually feedback from my own patients creates, it's this loop that creates this, it creates a sense of not just, competence and confidence, but joy that comes with creating something different than what the medical system's providing. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, I did, because I think you provide an example of all 3 of those. Autonomy, where even in your prior group, where it was I believe it was like a physician run group. You're a physician anesthesiologist. With
We had anesthesia teams,
anesthesia teams, but it wasn't like you were owned by some private equity corporation that was dictating from
No.
above. But even in those practice environments, particularly if you're the junior, you don't have necessarily control. So now you're in your own kind of concierge type practice. You have a sense of autonomy because you are the one who dictates how you will run the anesthetic and how you will, that run that prop. You're solely responsible for that. Mastery, talked about that you've improved the process pathway here. So things like that you're doing with anesthesia pre-ops, and I know you're doing them via Zoom and you do them in advance, and you're creating videos around that to kind of make that onboarding process as easier. So there's a sense of mastery there. And then the purpose kind of bled through and how you discussed it, how your face lit up, your eyes kind of lit up, your little edges of your mouth started tweaking because you found that joy in it. And there was a sense of meaning. This was meaningful work for you because not only were you now practicing the way you wanted to, but you're practicing in such a way that you're making it better than what you've seen in the past. So I think that's an ideal situation where we're looking at how when you incorporate autonomy, mastery, and purpose into a practice, how that improves your life. And then my suspicion is that your patients that you're involved with, this is probably an overall positive gain for them as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Now we can counter that though to a traditional healthcare system where it is absolutely fascinating to me where the physicians are now seen as the cogs. We're the income producing cogs in this wheel. And yet we have people who are often non-medical in these kind of mid-level management roles who, instead of seeing their job as how do I increase this driver for this physician, how do I create a practice environment for them to excel? In many ways, they put up these barriers, these extrinsic factors that are demotivating in many ways, where they take away the sense of control of your practice. Like, I do not understand in this day and age, why does a hospital have to have, a clinic hours between 7 and 5 or 8 and 5 or whatever the case may be? Why couldn't flexible clinic hours be incorporated on a way that is involved with the physician? So they're not saying now you're going to do Saturday hours because we're going to open a clinic and that's what, our little internal metrics or our high price consultants come in. But they say, well, how can we design a schedule that incorporates what makes the best sense for you as a family person in your physician practice, but actually, and then also matches the needs of our community. So inviting that discussion there. So the other one is also that sense of purpose, I think, is where people feel in a lot of ways, or at least in modern medicine, is they can't provide the care that they want to, where we are being extrinsically driven by metrics. Press-Ganey is the one that comes up, how the patient satisfaction scores, which so many of them are being documented and used for reimbursement to physicians. In some ways, your Press-Ganey becomes a part of your compensation package. And if you've ever looked at the questions on Press-Ganey, like 80% of them have absolutely nothing to do with what the physician does. But, did the receptionist pick up the phone and say, howdy doody, whatever their stupid greeting that they're supposed to have every time that comes in. And it's just so it's very easy to see how we have a burned out physician workforce because we have these systems in some ways that don't seem to understand fundamental human needs and fundamental human behavior and have a desire to actually make things better for those employees. And while we're specifically discussing physician and physician practice here, this really goes down to any sort of corporate environment.
Right.
How is it that you craft a environment where you make your workers, people who are employed in that thing, feel autonomous, so they have a sense of control in what they do, that there is mastery involved in that craft. So whatever it is that they're doing, that they're learning, growing, feeling more comfortable and more competent over time, and that there is a purpose in that. So they feel fulfilled while they're doing their work. And that's being reflected because they're feeling more confident and better in that job role that is reflected in the customer base. So in healthcare, it would be the patient, so that patients see that come through.
Right.
So I know I'm on a little bit of rant here, but I'm just
Yeah. No, it made me think of a couple things that, so interestingly, because the medical system's not perfect and not designed, I think, in a way that's ideal, especially for like anesthesia patients, which I've actually had one person be like, wow, it never really made sense. We just met you like day of, if it's an elective, scheduled, prepaid kind of thing. And I was like, yeah, well, the thing is, the reality is when things are not perfect, when there can be honing of that business to optimize it for the customer or the client, part of my feeling of meaning is because it's not perfect, because I'm creating something, I think, a better product, a better service, that I derive more gratification and meaning out of that because there's a problem. So interestingly, if you have employees, who's better at maybe giving you feedback at the process, at the end user, where they're probably engaging with the customer or the client? So you have to open up the conversation to enable them. They need to feel comfortable that they can give feedback without worrying about losing their job or any other concerns. So you can create a little bit more autonomy and a sense of meaning by the mere nature of, if you want to really make the business ideal for the client and the customer, not the medical industrial complex, but the patient. If we are focused on the end user, that is the perfect opportunity to engage your staff, all of your employees, to really get the most out of their job and probably have the best retention, which we know that there's a huge cost in turnover and training and all of those things, and the gaps in the care. So yeah, those are my initial thoughts, is that this is a primed opportunity. I think the problem is that we know that the medical industrial complex is not focused necessarily on that end user. And so that's where you have to create, I think, from the bottom up, something in order to really optimize a business like that.
That sort of lead from behind model, where they'll often talk about where you were asked, instead of sitting on top of the pyramid like the CEOs can do in these organizations and dictating from high, you get out in the trenches and you see what people need, so that you're behind them and you're supporting them through that process. This kind of makes me think of Tony Hsieh, who is the founder of Zappos, who has sadly passed, but he had that book, Delivering Happiness. And one of the core things about Zappos, which I always kind of found interesting, was that they say we're a shoe company. We're actually a customer service company disguised as a shoe company, where the whole idea behind it was customer service. And you would think, well, if you're kind of catering to the needs of your customers, that would drive people out. Like in healthcare, there's all this complaints about, oh, I have to share the medical record with my patient. There's arguments there, and that's a whole different discussion in many ways, but it doesn't have to be nearly as frightening to you. But for Zappos, when they're kind of bending over backwards, that's becomes the mission of the organization. One of the things that they incorporated was everybody had to be on the phones. So you had C-suite level managers were supposed to do, I can't remember, like at least once every quarter, that they were the ones answering the customer service telephones. So, and that takes a degree of humility, I think, in some ways. Particularly if you're into the ego-driven role, which all of us can be victims of in many shape or form, that we're somehow better than doing that, doing this activity. But it would be really nice in times to see, particularly in a larger healthcare system, that leaders would actually get into the trenches. They should be the ones answering the phone. They should be the ones, this is my own personal pet peeve, so this is something that we typically experience in my area. They should call in and try to make an appointment with their primary care doc using the basic phone line that they're subjecting everybody else to.
Right.
And because I've even talked to the physicians in these health systems who are pissed off at the inability that their own patients cannot schedule appointments with them in a way that doesn't take 45 minutes and 65 pushing the buttons to get through the phone tree. And even then you may get disconnected or sent off to somewhere. It's fascinating to me, but let's talk about a little bit about a sense of in your so you opted out and you are in a kind of a unique space where you've created this autonomy, mastery, and purpose. But I'm wondering, what about those people who are still in a healthcare system? What are ways that you can think of, or at least kind of brainstorm on ways that you can increase a sense of autonomy, mastery, and purpose, when perhaps the external variables are ones that you cannot directly control in the next, we are all, I hate to say you're not in control because everybody has an active choice, but let's just say for the next 2 weeks to 2 months where if you're not quitting your job, what are these things that you can do to kind of increase the sense of autonomy, mastery, and purpose?
Well, first of all, I mean, never underestimate at least trying to reach out to the powers that be, and stating your case, and have the evidence and to support that, to see if you can leverage change. Sometimes people just don't feel like they could make a change, but in some places you might be able to. Secondly, even within my own practice, when I was still with the group, I would do the things that help serve me, I guess, personally, make me feel more content with the service I was giving. Even though I didn't get paid for it, I would put in the extra effort to educate on the things that I didn't feel like they, understood well, and give them my time, which, as much as I could, and or create videos online, like create, a quick link that you can give your patients to help give them the value, or help kind of delineate things out better, so that they can play it for their families or their spouse that's not able to make the visit. They can listen to it multiple times. So educational things were kind of my way of, making a difference and feeling some autonomy, and something that was very creative and unique to me. You could write a book, you could do a blog, you could do a podcast, there's ways of sourcing out something that's uniquely you, that can be easily digestible or free for your patients. Of course, you can monetize it, but I think most of us, when we want to make a difference, it's not so much the money. Many times, the things we're passionate about, we're willing to do for free, at least for a while, and trial that out. And sometimes just a new endeavor can actually add a little spice to your career. Gives you something different to look forward to, and it's not the same mundane kind of routine and ritual that happens within the confines of wherever you're working. We don't seem to be able to change anything. So those are my initial thoughts. Anything you'd add?
Yeah, I was just thinking specifically is targeting as those three things. So I'm thinking a sense of autonomy if you're in an employed position. I think the very, very first thing I would emphasize to everybody is you always have a choice. Right. And recognizing that. So I do not have to go into the office. I am choosing to work in this practice. Right. And that I think is super, super key, because people get into these false narratives where they are stuck. I am trapped. No, we are in a free nation. We still have active choice. Nobody, you may feel like an indentured servitude because you have $500,000 in student loans, but you always have an active choice. And if you choose not to do it, that is still it preserves a sense of autonomy better than, that perception of I have to do it. So right. I would emphasize for everyone always to be very, very mindful that you have an active choice. And if you choose then to stay, it is because you're choosing to, not because Joe Smith in HR is saying you have to stay or whatever your contract requires you. The second thing is that sense of mastery, and that you kind of touched on there, is even in an employed practice, there are things that you can see, well, how can I improve something that's in my control? So you may not have control over the phone trees. You may not have control over, even in some situations, who your medical assistants are, but you can try to find ways to design and improve that process. If there's something that you're repeating over and over again, maybe you can create a handout. Or like you said, with recording videos, where you can actually record a video where you can direct people, hey, I made this thing on YouTube. You want to check it out? It's free just to look at it. But anything that you can do to increase a sense of improvement in the things that you're directly related to. If you're in a procedural practice, that becomes easier because you're like focused on the actual, well, how do I get better at this procedure? How do I practice this? How do I close this in this scenario better, more efficiently, with better outcomes for my patient? So really kind of doing that own personal process standpoint, where we're trying to do that personal improvement. And then the purpose, I think, in a lot of ways, as long as you're focusing on the one. So we sometimes, and I'm totally guilty, this is the way my brain is, always goes macro, and you want change, you want to revolutionize the system, you want everything to change overnight. And though that will quickly burn you out, because you see how frustrating it is. And so if you're in that position where you maybe have less impact on things beyond those four walls when you're in that room, is how can you narrow that scope to how can I make this a meaningful visit for me And how can I make this a meaningful visit for my patient who's in front of me? So just a couple little perceptual shifts, I would say, but you're really focusing on, again, on those three: autonomy, mastery, and purpose, making sure you have a sense of choice, always maintaining that sense of choice and autonomy in what you do. Do those kind of little micro practice improvements. So picking and choosing the things you have direct control over to make and improve those better. And then lastly is that micro sort of focusing down on how you can make this interaction better for you, as well as better and more meaningful for your patient in front of you.
That was a great summary of the podcast episode, I think. My last thought before taking us out on this would be that, you talk about autonomy and mastery, and it's not just within the confines. You're talking about people that are still stuck in those jobs and don't fully have all those things. Sometimes it's about modifying within within the actual practice you have, and then sometimes can be modifying the autonomy of the time you spend there, so you can either change into something different, like you said, you have a choice, or going to administration about changing how much time, going part-time, or changing your schedule like you were talking earlier, or doing locums, or doing a little bit of foot in one thing and a foot in your current career. And so there's so many ways. There's definitely no cookie cutter thing with all those things you were discussing. Any comment off of that?
No, I think the only last part to kind of tag on to what you just said, before I think you need to take us out with an amazeballs exit here.
Yes.
It was really what that's focusing on, is that sense of autonomy. And I think that's really sort of the purpose of the Change Physician podcast, is to emphasize that we all have a choice. And how can you find these little steps, whether it is within yourself or whether it is these external agents, or finding a model, so that you can be involved in active choice and to increase that sense of autonomy. Because that's the worst thing that I think I've seen. That's the worst thing I've ever experienced. I think in many ways, that's the problem with being a physician, and at least in the United States right now, is we have lost a sense of autonomy in what we do. And the purpose of this podcast in a lot of ways is to return that sense, to recognize that we all have a choice. We all have this fantastic education, and there are a lot more opportunities out there than most people would like us to believe.
I think all of us want autonomy, and that's, I think, the perfect thing, especially the way things have changed since insurance world has come into the world of medicine. And so we have to be able to recapture that autonomy. And I know I have felt a sense of relief to not feel such a lack of that. And so I'm very appreciative of that. And I'm glad you brought up this topic, and those principles, I think, are a great thing to remember, so that each person out there listening to this can tailor it to their own lives and their careers. And for those of you listening, if you haven't come across the Change Physician, you can go to thechangephysician.com and join our community there. Whether you're a physician or a physician ally, we'd love to have you there. You can check out all our podcast episodes and audio versions all across all the podcast venues. Of course, you can check out YouTube for our video versions. And of course, we are on Instagram. We try to post within a week or so of when those podcasts are released, so you know that they're out there. And we'd love to see any comments. Feel free to subscribe, and we will look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Again, I am Melissa Cady, the Challenge Doctor, with my Amazeballs co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, and we'll see you later. Take care.
Stay well, folks.